Welcome, everyone. Thank you for participating in ALSN's August webinar. Today, we have joining us Dr. Rose Sherman. She will be presenting on From Traditional Leader to Nurse Leader Coach. Just a few housekeeping items. At the end of this webinar, you'll see where you can raise your hand in the participant box, and you can type in your questions. If at any time you need to gain some assistance from me, if you're having technical difficulties, I'm going to give you my direct dial number, which is 517-220-2387. At this time, I'd like to introduce Dr. Rose Sherman. Dr. Sherman is nationally known for her work in helping current and future nurse leaders to develop their leadership and coaching skills. Rose is an emeritus professor in the Christine E. Lynn College of Nursing at Florida Atlantic University, where she was a tenured professor and director of the Nursing Leadership Institute for 17 years. Prior to teaching at FAU, Rose had a 25-year leadership career with the Department of Veteran Affairs at 5 VA medical centers. She currently serves as a faculty member in the Marion K. Shaughnessy Nursing Leadership Academy at Case Western Reserve University. Rose has published more than 100 peer-reviewed articles and was named the 2018 AONE Nurse Researcher of the Year. She is an alumnus of the Robert Wood Johnson Executive Nurse Fellowship Program and is a fellow in the American Academy of Nursing. She edits a popular leadership blog, emergingrnleader.com, that is read by thousands of nurses each week, and is editor-in-chief of Nurse Leader, the official journal of the AONE executives. She is a Gallup certified strengths coach and author of the new book, The Nurse Leader Coach, Become the Boss No One Wants to Leave. Take it away, Rose.
Okay, well, thank you, Kristen, and welcome to everyone on the webinar, whether you're live or watching it at a later date. The topic that we're going to be talking about today is one that I feel pretty passionate about because it involves how we as both academic and practice leaders and educators should be looking at the needs of the contemporary nursing workforce and then really evaluating not only what are the implications for our nurse leadership practice, but also what do we need to be doing in terms of educating our current and future nurse leaders. And I think the timing on the webinar is really wonderful because for those of you that are in academic settings, you know that your academic year is either just beginning or will shortly begin. And so hopefully some of the information that we talk about today are things that you'll consider incorporating into your leadership development programs. As Kristen mentioned, we will be taking questions at the end, so please feel free to put your questions in the question box. And if you do want a copy of the slides that I go through today, I'm happy to send you a link to the OneDrive with the slide presentation in it. So the quote on this slide here, "What got you here won't get you there," is from Marshall Goldsmith. And I'm sure that some of you are aware of Marshall Goldsmith's work. He's really considered to be probably one of the most prominent executive leadership coaches in the country. He really coaches all of the Fortune 500 CEOs. And it's been a little more than a decade since he wrote a book of the same title. And I consider the book, What Got You Here Won't Get You There, a must read for leaders. I recommend it all the time because the point of the book is that the major reason why leaders derail is that they're unwilling to change when circumstances change. And I think that this is especially important in leadership today because as the work environment and as the workforce changes, so too must leaders. And we must be willing to make what John Maxwell, hopefully some of you have seen his new book, Leader Shifts. And I think the leader shifts in our thinking become important because we really always need to be asking ourselves the question, what have you really changed your mind about in the last year or so, or maybe the last 5 years? And ask that question about leadership. So we have 3 topics that we're going to talk about in the webinar today. The first topic will be we'll be taking a look at the changing healthcare environment and the workforce landscape, and how this is really leading to a different set of expectations for leaders. Our second topic will be that we're going to consider the growing body of evidence that's really pointing to the reality that our frontline nurse managers are really the linchpins for recruitment, retention, quality, safety, and organizational excellence. And there really is a compelling business case to teach them how to become nurse leader coaches. And the final topic will be, how do you make the transition from a traditional leader to a nurse leader coach? So let's talk about, first of all, what types of trends are we seeing in our environment, because we're in the midst of some very challenging times in healthcare. There's a clear focus on value-based purchasing, and almost every week we now see in the policy arena that there's a call for transparency in pricing. Last week, it was about all of the providers out of service networks when people come in the hospital and how there's no transparency with that. And, and I think these trends will continue. To cope with some of the declining reimbursements that we've seen really a decade of mergers and acquisitions in healthcare as organizations really struggle to achieve really economies of scale. What I think is true is that the impact of these supersized health systems is really not clear. And for those of you that are looking for areas where I think there's really a compelling need for future nursing research, this, in my opinion, is really a need to really look at the leader experience in these supersized healthcare systems, because anecdotal evidence is really suggesting that some of the geographic context, which has always been important both in leadership and healthcare, is being lost as more decisions are being made centrally, often really outside the geographic area where our health systems are located. At the same time, we know that healthcare itself is undergoing much disruption, and some of this disruption, in fact, a lot of it will probably come from organizations not currently involved in the healthcare sector, like Apple. It's not lost on any corporate CEOs that healthcare is a $3.2 trillion industry. And there's really probably a lot of money to be made at some point. We do know that the future could look very different. I think that many of us are looking at this interesting experiment that involves Amazon, Berkshire Hathaway, and JP Morgan Chase, where they've entered this cooperative agreement to really self-insure their more than 1 million employees. Now, we're unsure about what this means or where it will go, but what is clear is Atul Gawande, and some of you are probably familiar with his work. He wrote the Surgical Manifesto, and he happens to be the CEO of this venture, and what he is committed to is really driving administrative costs from healthcare. And at least one of these companies, we didn't think so initially that they really might become actual providers of care, but it looks like Amazon is likely to become actively involved as a provider of care, probably initially in the pharmaceutical arena. But we also are hearing that Amazon is really strongly considering moving into home care, and they've even made some strategic nursing hires to kind of help them do the planning in this area. So that should be an interesting trend to watch. And, at the same time that we're seeing these dramatic shifts happening in our healthcare environment, we're also seeing some really big changes with our nursing workforce. Now this slide that's up right now, it captures some research that was done by Catalyst Learning in 2018. And what they do is every year they go out and they do surveys of their chief nursing officers that are really partnering with them to look at what the challenges are for nursing. And you can see that the 7 challenges for nursing in the future, that a lot of them do involve the workforce. The loss of nurses to retirement and expanding employment options, the issue of recruitment and retention, nurse disengagement, which increasingly I'm hearing a lot about from managers as a problem of disengagement, turnover in the C-suite. We don't have really good current information about chief nursing officer turnover. The last major research study that was done on this was done in 2013, but we will have soon, because we have a partnership between AONL and AMN Healthcare, and a colleague of mine, Joyce Batchelor, is really involved in this research. They're going to be looking at CNO turnover, so I think a lot of us are really going to anxiously await what they find. Declining reimbursements, which we just talked about, rising labor costs for contract staff, and in some cases even the unavailability of contract staff. But I've highlighted the last one, which is turnover of nurse leaders, because this is something, to be quite honest with you, I have never seen come up on CNO surveys before, but it is a growing problem, and one that we'll talk about a little bit later as we look at some of the nursing research. So this is a slide from, actually it's an advisory board slide. And the point of this slide is that the nursing workforce is really shifting demographically. And currently the millennial cohort is the largest cohort in the nursing workforce. And this trend is really expected to continue over the next decade as more and more baby boomer nurses move out of nursing. So I think what we're seeing right now is actually 2 kinds of nursing shortages in the country today. The first is an actual shortage of RN candidates to fill the positions. And what's interesting, as I do work nationally, is that this is very geographic. There are some areas of the country that don't seem to be experiencing a nursing shortage, and then there are other areas of the country where it really is a very significant problem. However, the second type of shortage that I'm going to talk about is one that I think across the board everyone is experiencing, and that is a shortage of experienced nurses to fill positions. So this has led to an experience complexity gap. And I think if you talk with most nurse managers in the country today, they will verify that this is a growing problem for them, as fewer and fewer of their core staff, even in areas like specialty units like ED and critical care, few of the staff have more than 3 years of experience. And we know from the work that Patricia Benner has done from novice to expert that it really takes about 3 years experience to achieve competency. But this experience complexity gap is really creating some really big challenges for nurse managers. In fact, I think there's a growing sense that it probably is contributing to some of the issues that healthcare systems are having in moving the needle on patient experience, because we know, and we have an article, an interesting article in Nurse Leader this month by Josh Wolf, who heads the Barrel Institute. We do know that competency of staff is something that patients really think about in terms of their experience. So that'll be something that we need to really pay attention to. The other reality with our workforce is that nurse turnover is on the rise. This is 2019 data that you're looking at on this slide. It comes from the National Healthcare Retention and RN Staffing Report. And right now, our national turnover is about 17.2%. across the board. Some areas have much higher turnover, others are experiencing less turnover. The average cost of RN turnover per nurse is a little bit over $52,000, but this is really on the lower end. If you look at areas like perioperative nursing, the data that I've looked at in perioperative nursing indicates that it's probably double the cost, and probably is in other specialty areas as well. We also know that the cost to the average hospital, if you look at the average hospital and the number of FTE they have and the kind of turnover that they're experiencing right now, the cost is between $4 and $7 million. And I thought what was interesting in this 2019 data in this report was how few hospitals actually track the costs of their turnover. So this is something I think that is a real concern, because they found that more than half don't even know what the costs of their turnover are. The highest turnover continues to be in the first 2 years of practice, and this is something that we've seen for a very long time, starting with the data that NYU collected over that 10-year span. The turnover in the first 3 years of practice we know is close to 50%, and in the first 2 years it's kind of broaching about 40%. And the highest turnover is in terms of specialty areas is in the ED, mental health, and telemetry. These are areas where I think we're also seeing the highest levels of stress and burnout. And I'm going to particularly highlight mental health, because I've seen some recent data in mental health that really suggests turnover in mental health is really on the rise. So that's something that we'll really need to track as the mental health problems in the country continue to grow. Now, one question that I'm often asked about turnover is when looking at the millennial cohort, is it just a function of their age and stage of life, or are we seeing some real changes with this particular generation in terms of their willingness to move from job to job? And the slide that you're looking at right now is one from Gallup, and Gallup, in their research and evaluation, looking at really 40 years worth of data, has assessed this and is telling organizations right now that millennials are more likely to job hop and will be more challenging to retain. So this is not, I guess the point is that this is not a problem that's going away. And what's interesting right now, again, this is Gallup data, is that most millennials that were studied are actually leaving their organizations when they change roles. And I saw data that just came out from Gallup this morning about exit interviews of millennials, and they're saying that 52% of millennials are very dissatisfied with the conversations that they've had with their managers about their career development, and it's driving some of this turnover that we're starting to see. Now, the good news is I think that we're starting to see a shift in how nurse leaders are beginning to look at the whole concept of turnover, where I think historically a lot of organizations held individual managers accountable for turnover within their units. We now, the focus on turnover now is really wanting to retain nurses not only within the hospital, but within their own health systems, because we realize that if we have a new graduate that starts on a med-surg unit, if that organization does not give that new graduate an opportunity to move into a specialty area, if that new graduate wants to, then another organization will. So some of the policies around having to stay on a unit for a year are really failing in many organizations, I think, and is something that people have. One of the things I think a lot of leaders have really changed their minds about. What is also clear as we look at the workforce is that nursing leadership has a long way to go in terms of how staff perceive their leaders. Now, this slide illustrates some data that we published in Nurse Leader from the AACN 2018 Healthy Work Environment study that was done with a very robust cohort of over 8,000 critical care nurses. You can see that 61% of these nurses evaluated their managers being good or very good. That the data was not so great for the chief nursing officers, but 13%, you have a full 39% there that evaluated their manager as being either poor or fair. And for CNOs, the news is even less good. More than 50% said their chief nursing officers were poor or fair. Now, a reason why I think the data that AACN has put together is so compelling and worth paying attention to is what we probably already know, and that is that nurses don't leave organizations, they leave leaders. And if you look at the data from 2018 on this slide, you can see that more than 50% of critical care nurses intend to leave their current employers within 3 years. And this is very concerning data, not only because the costs of specialty training, but also the disruption this causes to units when they have this kind of turnover. Now, all generations, as you look at the research, all generations want similar things from leaders, but they prioritize their wants in a little bit different way. And this is Workforce 2020 data that you can look at. And you can see for Generation Y or Millennials, their top 3 priorities are really coaching kinds of behaviors. Will help me to develop my career, will give me straight feedback, will mentor and coach me. This is 1, 2, and 3 for them. And of course, it really isn't for nurses in other generational cohorts. And, this is additional Gallup data that indicates that 87% of millennials, when they're looking for new employment, they really are rating professional or career growth and development opportunities as being very important to them as they really look at evaluating new employers. Also, this opportunity to learn and grow is really the only factor of retention that separates millennials and non-millennials, meaning that millennials are likely to leave if they don't get this, whereas other generational cohorts historically have not been. I think a very important piece of work, if you haven't seen it, was published by Gallup in May 2019, and it's titled "It's the Manager." And Gallup analyzed 40 years of data to draw conclusions, and this included the data that they're doing around employee engagement, satisfaction, turnover, in addition to interviewing literally thousands of millennials. And their data includes a lot of healthcare organizations as well. So they highlight some 6 key changes that organizations will need to make to really respond to the needs and wants, not only of the millennials, but Generation Z, who we're seeing in our nursing schools right now and are just really starting to move into the nursing workforce. We've always known that millennials are really interested in purpose, and they're very purpose-driven in their work. They want development, something that we just discussed. Millennials and Generation Z don't want bosses. They want their leaders to be coaches. They don't want the annual review, which is still a pretty traditional thing in healthcare. They want ongoing conversations. And millennials and Generation Z don't want managers who focus on their weaknesses. They want more of a strengths orientation in leadership. So Gallup is currently saying that it's their feeling that if organizations were really to want to target one area that they could really take a look at that will be a success factor in the future, it's really this idea of teaching their managers to be more coach-like. And one other key finding that Gallup has in this book, It's the Manager, which is why they titled it It's the Manager, is their belief that it's really the frontline manager that is the linchpin. So for nursing, this would be the nurse manager being the linchpin in recruitment, retention, and satisfaction. And it was the focus of the 2019 Gallup Summit. Now, I've been attending these summits for the better part of 3 years, and I've never been at a summit where they did focus a lot on it's the manager, where they called out a specific industry that they felt was not doing a good job in really working with their managers to provide what the workforce needed. And that was healthcare. Specifically nurse managers. They have been doing work with some very large health systems right now, which will remain nameless. They did name them, but they see major issues in terms of span of control, which we all know about, and other issues that really aren't being addressed. They also said they were very shocked at how many nurse managers that they interviewed that were highly dissatisfied with their work and were thinking about leaving their roles. So all of the evidence that we're seeing is really kind of pointing in the same direction, whether it be Gallup evidence, evidence from the American Association of Critical Care Nurses that we just talked about. We're also seeing Versant evidence, and Elaine Smith and her crew down at Eastern Carolina University published some data in 2018 in Jonah, looking at the criticality of the nurse manager in terms of supporting new graduates. And then Prescaney data that Chris Dempsey and her researchers there at Prescaney have published some white papers where they've really looked at the impact of the manager on a wide range of patient outcomes. And so they too have found that the manager is really linchpin in achieving at least some of the outcomes. So the evidence tells us that nurse managers really matter. And so this again is data from AACN. So when the manager is evaluated as either fair or poor, and you can see on the right-hand side of the column, fair or poor, the percentage of nurses who are satisfied with their roles declines according to the overall effectiveness rating of their frontline managers. The overall satisfaction with the job declines, and it's pretty striking that if a manager is evaluated as being poor, only 2% of respondents are satisfied with their work. And then the overall effectiveness of the manager, of course, has a real impact on whether a nurse will leave their current position. You can see 43% of nurses who felt that their managers were poor rate also indicated that they would leave their positions within the next 12 months. Not surprisingly, there's another piece of data that becomes important, and that is engagement data. And this is Gallup data here that indicates that manager engagement explains about 70% of variance in staff engagement. And Gallup reports that almost 2/3 of managers are either not engaged or actively disengaged in their work. And I think when you think about this, this really helps to explain why some organizational initiatives that have taken place to improve engagement across the board in an organization are often met with mixed results, because if the manager isn't on board with what's being done, the staff will not be on board. So Gallup points out that there's really 4 things that nurses need from their manager. The first is job clarity and priorities, which we know is important, and of course is asked as part of what Gallup looks at in terms of engagement, ongoing feedback and communication, opportunities to grow and learn, and then accountability for their leadership practices. Now, at the same time that I'm pointing all this out, we know that the nurse manager role is extremely challenging. So when we talk about the need for managers to become coaches, we can't ignore the challenges in these positions that we know from nursing research. What you see here on this slide is the metaphor of a sandwich, because this is the way many nurse managers describe their role. They feel like they're really squeezed in between administrative expectations on the top, coming down from the top, and staff expectations coming down from underneath. And so some of what we're seeing is that these managers report role overload and work volume, lack of administrative support. You know, there's tremendous pressure with the performance measures and a lot of dissatisfaction, growing dissatisfaction from many managers that they're being held accountable for performance measures that they really don't have full control over. And then this idea about 24/7 accountability. I think that many, especially of our newer and younger managers, are having significant issues with boundaries around their work and trying to really stop the flow of communication that's coming to them on the weekends. We also know from recent data that was published by Dr. Nora Warchowski, who's really our nurse researcher expert on the manager role, that it takes time to develop manager competencies. And I think this is data that Nora has recently published in Jonah. And, you know, I thought it was interesting that the managers themselves feel that proficiency really isn't achieved until 7 years in the role. And yet we know that we have this growing problem, which Nora has documented in her study, that the average length of stay in a time manager role seems to be less than 3 years. And this is a growing concern. We don't have good data about it, but this did pop out from the research that she did. And, you know, if we look at the research on manager turnover, the corporate research, we haven't done a lot of research around this in nursing, probably need to. What is really the impact of nurse manager turnover on units? We do know that the research tells us, organizational research tells us that there's a loss of trust, that staff don't feel supported, that when managers leave, which makes sense, staff are more likely to leave, so we're going to experience higher turnover. This fourth one I think is really key in healthcare, the inability to maintain high reliability organizations in terms of safety and quality, and that's because we really count heavily on our managers to drive down into the front line changes in policies and procedures, which are coming at a very rapid rate right now. And then this last one is something that I hear a lot from managers who take over roles that on units that maybe have been through a series of managers or maybe had an interim manager for a period of time or perhaps no manager, is that there's really higher risk for normalization of deviant, unprofessional behaviors. So our challenge really is, how do we help our managers transition within the context of knowing what we know about their roles and knowing all of what's happening in the healthcare environment? How do they transition into being these nurse leader coaches? Because this is really what the contemporary workforce wants. You know, and sometimes I think inspiration can come from outside of healthcare. For many years, Google, as an example, didn't believe that managers were even necessary. They thought if they hired great individual performers, they wouldn't need coaching, they wouldn't need frontline managers. And they later recognized that they were wrong, and they launched Project Oxygen to really teach their managers how to be great coaches and leaders. And you can find some of their tools on their Google Work website. I think they've got a lot of great tools there, but look at what they've highlighted in blue, and that is that managers need to become great coaches. So what is different? Gallup found what we also know to be true from Gallup, and or Google found what Gallup also found, that the traditional manager or the traditional leader approach just isn't working with the contemporary workforce. And these are some of the key differences between traditional leaders and nurse leader coaches. And I'd just like to highlight a couple of them. A traditional leader is really more focused on performance, whereas a coach is also focused on helping staff grow and develop. Not that performance doesn't matter, but there's also this growth and development need that our workforce needs. A traditional leader would provide feedback only when needed. So the approach would be no news is good news, kind of the approach that I was exposed to when I was during my nursing career. But we know that our contemporary workforce really wants more real-time feedback. They want coaches that build on their strengths, and they want unlike traditional leaders who spent more time talking than listening, they want coaches to really listen to what they have to say and ask, what can we do together? Yet what's interesting is, if we look at the work environment in general, what millennials are saying is that they're really not receiving this feedback from their leaders currently. Only 19% report receiving routine feedback, and 17% report receiving meaningful feedback. And how much feedback is enough? What Gallup is saying is that engagement is higher among employees who meet with their manager at least once a week. Now, here's the challenge in nursing. That is pretty challenging. And I believe that right now, if you look at Gallup data in general, 56% of managers, of millennials, meet with their manager less than once a month. It might even be higher in our nursing environments, and 21% meet with their manager on a weekly basis. I don't think we'd see that kind of data in nursing. Now, what's interesting is the question, do leaders know how to coach, is that if you ask most leaders, do they know how to coach, they'll tell you they do. They'll tell you they've been coaching patients with their clinical work, and now they're shifting these skills to work with staff, but the evidence really suggests otherwise. Two Harvard researchers really looked at when, studied managers, observed them when they were quote unquote coaching, and found that what the managers thought was coaching was either telling them what to do or giving them explicit advice. Now, this research wasn't done in healthcare, but I recently talked to a director of professional development in a large health system that did the same thing, this observational research, and she did it with new graduates, their managers, and she was the observer. She found basically the same thing as these Harvard researchers. So what we know is, to be effective leader coaches, our nurse managers need to be much more Yoda and much less Superman. And this is a metaphor that really seems to resonate with nurse managers, because here's the challenge for them, that most of them were promoted into their leadership roles because they're excellent clinicians and problem solvers. So naturally, that's how they see themselves adding value and want to continue adding value. Now, the challenge is that if staff aren't coached to solve their problems, they will not grow. And in fact, it can lead to the very significant issue of managers being overworked. And I think it's pretty interesting that our colleagues from Xavier published a study earlier this year in February in JONA, where they talked to professional coaches who worked with managers, who said that one of the issues that managers have is that they love this problem solving for staff, and so they never get out of the routine and they're solving the same problems over and over. So a key habit to break is really this whole idea about being an advice monster. And the other piece of it is that some managers complain to me that they are frustrated because staff don't follow their advice. And so the question is, I often tell them that their advice might not be the right advice or the best advice in the situation, that nurses really are more invested if they solve their own problems and create their own solutions. So here are some of the key elements of coaching. It really has to be goal focused, ask great questions, which we'll talk a little more about, listen to individualize, and then provide feedback and follow-up action. Now, one structured coaching model that I really like is used by the International Coaching Federation, and it's called the GROW coaching model, where you work with nurses on goals that they've established. You talk about what the reality of the situation is, including the obstacles that they might have, either self-imposed or organizationally imposed, that you talk about options, and then you establish a way forward. And this would be, how do we achieve the goals? What actions are we going to take? What type of timeline are we going to use? Now, there are 5 core coaching skills that managers really need to be taught. The first one is being fully present, which sounds obvious, but for busy managers, this is very difficult for them to stop what they're doing, move away from the computer, have eye contact with the staff member that they're talking to. But we do know that coaching is ineffective if the manager is not fully present. Active listening, ideally in a coaching situation, the coach is doing about 20% of the talking and the nurse would be doing 80%. Powerful questioning. The power of coaching is really in the question, and the questions need to be open-ended. Avoid using questions like why. The more open-ended and powerful the question, the more powerful the coaching. And then direct communication, keep it open, using stories, metaphors, and avoiding trigger words like no, but, however. These are words that can really totally shut down a conversation. And then follow-up accountability. This is really important, that staff need to own their own goals. The manager doesn't own the goals of the staff. Now, I often tell managers that conversations with staff are the most important tool that they have in their leadership toolbox. So what we want to do is make sure that they're having these conversations. And Gallup is recommending 5 different types of coaching conversations. The first one is to role orientation. This usually happens at the beginning when someone first comes on a unit, or if they're switching roles, maybe assuming more responsibility, maybe moving to charge. What does that mean? What do they need to be thinking about? Then the quick connect. These are connections that can be made on email, that can be made in the hallway. They're very short connects with staff. How is everything going? Were you able to do this, that, or the other thing that we talked about before? How can I best support you? The check-in is a little bit longer conversation. This would be a good place to follow up on maybe career goals or performance goals that staff have. The developmental coaching is when we sit down to really have these conversations about professional development, about career development. And then progress reviews are really the more of the annual evaluation. And I'm happy to say I was talking with an organization the other day, a very large health system, that has taken their annual review and they've split it into 4 quarterly progress reviews. And what was brilliant about what they did, they happen to be a magnet organization, but they've structured each of the quarters to really focus on a different thing. And one of the things that a lot of organizations are struggling with right now is the new magnet requirements around conversations involving succession planning. So they've actually taken one of these quarterly reviews and they focus that conversation on succession planning. What is it that this nurse wants to do with her career? Is there a way to move her into a succession plan? So the goal with managers, I think, in the interest of the time they have, is really to help them integrate these conversations into things that they're already doing, like shift huddles, like leadership rounding. How can they take the time that they have and just use it and structure it a little bit differently? I had mentioned before the importance of conversations. These are examples of some questions that I call Kickstarter questions, like what's on your mind, what's the real challenge for you, what's the most important thing you've learned about yourself as a new graduate, what actions do you need to take but are avoiding, what are the best sources of feedback for you, how can I best support you as a leader. There are many, many, many coaching questions, and I kind of urge our managers to kind of pick 1 or 2 go-to questions that they're really comfortable asking. Now, what the irony is, if you ask managers, which I have in my research, what they love most about their role, they'll tell you that it's developing their staff. And it's really their ability to not only make a difference in terms of the impact on care on their unit, but also seeing that growth and development in staff just really makes their day. Now, what we've done with the manager role, and this is a concern, is that we have really channeled their attention to their budgets, to their staffing, to their performance metrics, and really away from their staff. That's where we have really channeled their attention. So I think a significant part of really teaching and coaching them to be more coach leader-like is this whole idea about giving them permission, that this is a valued and important part of their role. Now, this is from Michael Bungay Stanier, and this is an excellent book. It's called The Coaching Habits, Say Less, Ask More, and Change the Way You Lead Forever. He's very well known in this area of coaching, but he's so right that while coaching sounds so easy, it really isn't. It takes managers practice. It's not something that's absolutely a natural thing for them to to begin coaching. And then the last thing I'd say is, a resource to help. It's one of the reasons, quite honestly, why I wrote the book, The Nurse Leader Coach, Become the Boss That No One Wants to Leave, because I do believe that it's an important skill set, but we can't assume that our leaders really know how to do that. It's not one that has necessarily been taught to them. So that kind of brings me to the end of my presentation, and I'm really interested in your comments and questions at this time. So Kristen, do we have some questions in the question box? Kristen's going to help moderate this.
Sure. At this time, as a reminder, if you would like to ask a question, please hover your cursor at the bottom of your screen for the chat function and go ahead and type in your question there. We'll give this a second, but thank you, Rose. We really appreciate your time with us today. Just as a reminder, this session is being recorded. If you found it of value to you and you would like to pass this on to others in your network, you will be able to purchase this on the ALSN website. Also a reminder, we have this year's conference in November at the UCLA Luskin Center, early November. So if you have more questions or interest in attending this global conference, we do encourage you to go to nursingleadershipscience.org for more information. So Rose, I don't know if you see the question there.
No, I don't.
Okay. How
Read
would
it
you
to me.
recommend that we incorporate this content into leadership courses?
Okay, well, I think this is a good question, because now that we know, now that the research is telling us that coaching is an important skill for nurse leaders, it really needs to be managed in the same way we'd manage any other skill, such as budgeting. And I think, if you're looking at leadership development courses, whether they be in practice settings or in an academic setting, how do you assign this content, assigning articles around this content? If you have live classes, I think it would be a really good idea to have some paired experience where students could coach one another using coaching principles. And if not, if you're teaching online, you may want to assign a coaching experience as an assignment, where the student really needs to go out and coach a colleague and then come back in using the coaching principles, and then come back in and report back on their outcomes. I think the whole idea is really to get our nurses just begin practicing some of the key ideas that we talked about today. This idea about, did they ask open-ended questions? Did they do more listening than talking? Were they able to establish a way forward in terms of the goals that the coachee had? Those are the kinds of exercises I think we need to think about using. What else, Kristen?
Sure. We have a question that came in from Debbie Suda, and I'm going to type it in here for everyone in the chat. The question is, what recommendations would you have for the CNO? Are the expectations for that role to be coach as well for the staff and manager?
I think that's a good question, Debbie. I think what I would say with the chief nursing officers is that I think it's really important to role model behaviors that you expect of your leaders. So for a chief nursing officer, I think taking these same principles and incorporating them into coaching sessions with managers, because I think that has a twofold purpose. One is that it kind of allows you to focus on some of the goals that the manager either has for themselves, or some of the areas organizationally that we need to focus on. But the second thing that it does is it helps role model the behavior. I coach you, and I expect the same behavior from you that you'll coach staff. So great question. It should be done all the way up the organization.
Okay, we have another question. How would you make coaching work for older generations that might not be interested?
Well, that's a really good question, because it, you know, not all staff want to be coached, and you have to be respectful of that. We know that younger, we know our millennials and probably our Gen Zs who are coming up behind them, this coaching might be very important to them. If I'm a baby boomer nurse and I'm in the last 2 or 3 years of my career, it might not be as important to me. Now, but having said that, there may be areas where you do need to coach this nurse on, because one of the areas that I had talked about a little bit during the webinar was engagement. And one of the things that I'm hearing is that that some of our staff, seasoned staff, are disengaged. So if you see a staff member that's disengaged, I think coaching that staff member around engagement becomes important.
Okay, thank you. Do you have any advice for coaching up for the higher levels of leaders?
Coaching, you mean, I guess when we think about managing up, we think about how do you really manage up? How would you maybe coach your boss? Good question. I haven't really, to be frank, I haven't thought about that. Coaching, how does a manager coach or chief nursing officer? But okay, here's a good thing to start with. I think this whole idea about coaching in general. How do you want me to spend my time? If we know that that coaching is important to staff, and we all recognize as an organization that staff turnover becomes important, how can I, as a manager, fit this into my schedule? And how can you, as a leader, make this part of my performance evaluation, so that you recognize how important it is that I do coach? And you don't just put all of the emphasis on the budgeting and the staffing and performance metrics.
Okay. How can we convince executive leaders that coaching is an important part of the manager role when their focus is on budget and metrics?
Boy, this is such a great question, because it brings us back to that the reality that we talked about earlier in the webinar, that many organizations aren't even tracking the cost of RN turnover, both the real costs and the intangible costs, such as the impact on quality, safety, or the patient experience. I think, this is where the coaching up needs to take place. Executive nurse leaders really need to begin the education process with other members of the C-suite staff. And this is where I think, Gallup data can be really helpful. In fact, I would almost urge that, if you're in a situation where you don't think this is going to be valued, that you buy that book, It's the Manager, for your CEO, and ask him to read it, and then have a conversation.
Great. What would you say to a manager who tells you that it's impossible to be a coach for 60 plus staff?
Well, we do know that most of our managers today have this kind of FTE span. I would acknowledge, first of all, that it is challenging. I think we have to acknowledge that these managers are under a lot of stress and pressure. But at the same time, it's very time consuming to have to recruit new staff and onboard new staff. So what we need to do is, I think this is one of those mindset shifts that I talked about. We need to shift the idea of coaching as being a time dump or time consuming, and instead think about coaching as an investment. And then probably the other thing I would talk with this manager about is that if you start doing this and you get good at this, you probably will find that this is the most enjoyable part of your role. So I would say to look for ways also to strategically incorporate it into things that you're already doing, like we talked about before, the shift huddles or leader rounding.
Okay. How do you coach nurses who immediately become defensive when they are given any feedback?
This is a problem that some nurses have, and I hear this. I actually hear this quite often, that nurses become very defensive, and sometimes younger nurses may even think about feedback in a very catastrophic way. You're giving me feedback, that means I'm failing, I'm not doing a good job. I think the best way to really tackle this issue of inability to take feedback is to really create a culture of coaching. And that's why coaching really does become important. Because if there's an expectation that I'm both going to give and receive feedback, then when your staff member does become defensive, you can remind them that the goal of the culture that you have is that everyone needs to have a growth mindset. Carol Dweck talks about this idea about a growth mindset. And so they shouldn't become defensive, because the feedback that's being given to them is really designed to kind of promote their growth. Now, having said that, what I will say, and we didn't talk about this, but when you coach, it's very important that there is a relationship of trust and feelings of psychological safety before you begin your coaching. So if I don't trust you and you're my manager, and I have seen you lash out at people, and I have seen things happen on the unit, it will be hard for me to trust, and I might be defensive.
Okay. Could we develop our shift supervisors to adopt a coaching mindset? It would help extend the coaching reach of nurse managers.
Yeah, absolutely. I think, and probably not only the shift supervisors, I think charge nurses too. I think that charge nurses and shift supervisor is an excellent way to start, because I can tell you from having the experience of being a shift supervisor, what you find is that people call you about questions and problems that oftentimes they could have solved themselves. And so that's where coaching becomes important. What asking questions like, what would you do? What would you do in this situation if you could not get a hold of me? To kind of tease it out of the nurse so that they begin to answer their own questions. So yeah, I think that's really important.
Okay. How should a manager coach a new graduate who arrives on the unit and lets everyone know from the first day that they plan to go back to school to become a nurse practitioner?
Oh boy. I spoke with a manager yesterday who told me that this was one of her most common challenges. And she even asked me, I thought this was pretty funny, if we, meaning those of us in academia, if we inoculate new graduates with the I must return to school to become an NP vaccine before they graduate. What I have found is, and so I asked her the question, did you have a career conversation with her? And she said no. And this is very common, that nurse managers often, when they hear that, they don't have these career conversations where they push back and they really ask the question about the amount of due diligence that the nurse may have done about the NP role. Some organizations have even taken to offering a shadow day where a nurse can spend the day with a nurse practitioner, spend the day with a nurse anesthetist. And what some leaders have told me is that minds are often changed just in a day. They had no idea that the roles were as complex as they are. So I think career goals are good and we should support them, but graduate school is expensive, and we should help our young nurses really make wise choices by helping them broaden their horizons and in thinking about what they want to do next.
Okay, we have one last question here. What are the most challenging coaching conversations that managers report having with staff?
Well, it's kind of interesting because I'm doing interviewing with managers on this topic right now, and I just kind of highlight 3 conversations that managers tell me that they struggle with most. The first is the disengagement of experienced staff. Oftentimes nurses that are very technically experienced, have a lot of clinical background, but they're just simply disengaged. They don't get involved with any of the initiatives, with practice councils. How do you have those discussions? The second conversation that's very uncomfortable for a lot of managers is the use and abuse of sick leave and tardiness. And it goes like this: I have the conversation, then it's okay for a couple of weeks, then I have to have the conversation again. And then the third is, which I think is really interesting, the inability of nurses, whether they be in charge nurse roles or even team members, to provide direct feedback to other nurses. They want to come to the manager and talk with the manager about what someone else is doing. They don't want a direct conversation, and they don't want their name used. So those would be the 3 that I hear most frequently, Kristen.
Okay. Well, thank you, Dr. Sherman, for being here today and sharing your expertise with us. For the participants on this call, you will be receiving shortly an email from SurveyMonkey that will include questions about today's webinar. And once completed by the end of the week, we can go ahead and send you a certificate. Friendly reminder, again, we've got the 2019 ALSN Annual Conference coming up in UCLA, November 7th through 9th. We also have a virtual Hot Topics coming up on September 17th. So thank you all. If you have any questions, please feel free to reach out to me, and have a fantastic rest of your day.